So do you ever chase a feeling that doesn't make a whole lot of sense? Like you already have everything you need, but you're doing it just because it's fun. And that's what the OVF with the Ricoh GR III is to me. It's really for the vibes. Let's get into it. So hey, it's Elliot here, and today I'm just mostly going to talk about photography. So the optical viewfinder for the Ricoh GR III, some people would say it's unnecessary, and you know what, I can't say they're wrong. But sometimes photography isn't just about, being efficient, being right, it's about having fun. And that's kind of where I feel for this Smallrig 28mm optical viewfinder. It has no necessary purpose for me. For many people, I feel like this could be a bit of a gateway, especially if you've thought about picking up a more expensive optical viewfinder before, but you're not sure if you're going to like it. This kind of helps you get into it for a relatively inexpensive cost. So a little background, growing up, I did grow up in an era where we mostly used film cameras, and for the most part, they all had optical viewfinders. Sometime around 2005-ish, I switched entirely from film to digital camera, and at the time it felt really cool. You shot everything in auto, or at least I did. You just point and shoot and shot and got your photo out. And I didn't really mess again with viewfinders again until I think the Canon T3i, which had an optical viewfinder, but I actually quickly moved into the mirrorless world just because I thought the SLRs were kind of too large. And I had an A6000 which had an electric viewfinder. For the most part, it has been EVFs for me since. And then I got the Ricoh GR III in 2019. I had my original one for about 6 years, and I did have the Ricoh GV3, which is actually the one built for the GR3X and not the GR3. And that's because I mostly use it for portrait shooting. That viewfinder is quite expensive and in my view kind of overpriced. It's really hard to kind of recommend that you shoot with that thing. It probably is the most overpriced piece of gear that I ever had. I sold it last year when I sold my GR3, but as some of you will know, I regretted it. I went right back in and bought a Diary Edition GR3 this year, and I have a whole video about that, about how I just love the GR3, and that's why I'm back here. This kind of does scratch that itch for me. And the Smallrig 28mm optical viewfinder is one of the few kind of modern options you can have that's actually designed for compact cameras like the GR3. And it is made for that 28mm field of view, which is really what the Ricoh GR3 is. So this is the device itself. And I will say one thing, the build quality here is excellent. This one feels like a real finished product, not some kind of AliExpress special. I would put the build quality up there with the Ricoh GV2 and GV3. I really do like the build quality of this thing. It's all metal and glass with solid machining and really a nice kind of weight to it. It feels really solid. When you hold it, it doesn't feel like a knockoff. It feels like something that could have come from Ricoh itself. But man, look at how much it matches the Diary Edition here. Like it's uncanny. Now, when you actually put it up to your eye though, you'll notice one thing. There's no frame line system inside. So what you see is basically what you get. In addition, there's no diopter. Put it to my eye very differently from the way I put the GV3 up to my eye. And I'd say I probably have to get pretty tight, maybe about 1 or 2 centimeters away from my eye. Otherwise things get out of focus and I can't adjust it at all. When I first started using it, I'll admit it took me a little bit of time to get used to it. But once I did get comfortable with it, it did feel relatively natural, especially for slower, more deliberate shooting. Another thing to note is that this optical viewfinder has a 4:3 aspect ratio, another 3:2 aspect ratio that the Ricoh GR3 has. So what that means is what you see in the optical viewfinder, you kind of have to remember that the top and the bottom are going to be chopped off a little bit just because your sensor size is different from the actual optical viewfinder. I get why it's 4:3 because this is supposed to be a universal optical viewfinder, supportive of both micro four thirds and APS-C aspect ratios. It's just something you need to know if you're playing with this viewfinder. If you've used the OVF before, you know you can't really use it for something that's too up close. You got the parallax effect, and what that means is basically because there's this gap between what you're seeing with your eye and what your camera is seeing here. Once you get too close to something like this, the eye and the lens are going to see things very differently. And that's not a big deal when it's far away, but when it's up close, what you see in the OVF is going to be very different from what you see in the lens. But everything outside of kind of like 1.5 or 2 meters, I feel this is pretty usable, and it's actually going to get pretty close to what you see within the OVF. This is not going to help you focus at all. So you're going to have to run it in either snap mode or, preset the focus or use a pretty large auto focusing bracket. And sometimes when I shoot with this, I do shoot with the display off. I did that before I got the OVF, often when I kind of forget to charge the camera. And what happens is I just shoot. I kind of know where the 28mm view is going to look relative to the camera. It is also useful at a concert or at some dark venue where you kind of want to turn off the display. I guess it's not as big a deal nowadays because everyone uses their cell phones anyway, but then you can still frame, you know, whatever you're shooting within this. And I do find when I shoot with this, my hands are a bit steadier. And when you run it this way, you do kind of slow down and you get more thoughtful with your shooting. So there's no distractions, no menus, no exposure preview when you run it through the OVF, just you, the frame, and whatever you're shooting. Now I use it with the CPL filter on sometimes, and you will get a little bit of the barrel into the OVF, but that's okay from my perspective. That's pretty normal for an OVF. If you have glasses, the lack of diopter is probably going to be a problem. I don't need to wear glasses, and I can adjust how close I can get to my eye, but if you have glasses, I think you might be limited with how close you can get to it. Right off the top, I'd say the lack of frame lines and lack of diopter, it's probably a cost decision, but remember, this is actually significantly cheaper than the GV3 or GV2 options coming from Ricoh. So with that in mind, I do really like this for what it is. Now, if you've never used an optical viewfinder before, I do see this as something that's again, like a bit of a gateway to that world. It's kind of fun to use and it's not too expensive. It's well built and it gives you like a bit of a retro photographer experience. It's a good way to get into it for the vibes. And I don't mean that in a negative way at all. It does make you want to slow down and be more thoughtful with your shooting. And I think that's a good thing, especially when your iPhone can pretty much take an unlimited amount of photos. Sometimes, certainly I feel this way, that I just take as many photos as I can and pick out the best one. But with the Ricoh, it's more deliberate, it's slower, it's more intentional. And this optical viewfinder really does accentuate that. If you've watched my Ricoh video, you do know how much the Ricoh GR III to me is all about nostalgia. It is going to be a bit of a struggle to get a good shot, especially if you're using crop mode without frame lines to anticipate your shot. That is the biggest drawback. And if you ever use the Ricoh viewfinder or like a Leica viewfinder or anything else, pretty much the lack of frame lines and the diopter are probably going to really be noticeable, cause you to pause before buying this. Now, if I was talking to Smallrig and I had some constructive comments, I would have two things. Or three things rather. First of all, add frame lines. I don't know how much that's going to cost to the product, but I do think it would increase the usability of this product significantly. And in terms of frames, you know, the basic 28, 35, 50. I know this is not built just for the Ricoh GR III, but those focal lengths are pretty standard in terms of lens selection. So I do think that, you know, it wouldn't be wasted if you had those focal lengths in there. Second, say consider some level of magnification. Again, what I said earlier was I tended to like to use the GV3 instead of the GV2 because I tended to use the optical viewfinder more for framing portraits as opposed to just framing a wide scene. If you had a 50mm, I could use the crop mode and get in pretty close, and I can understand what I'm framing if there's frame lines, and I can get a little bit closer and I'll see things a bit more clear. Third, you know, a diopter adjustment. If you wear glasses, it would be easier to have a diopter adjustment and be able to just kind of customize what you see. But I'll give it a bit of a pass because I know the GV3 actually doesn't have a diopter either, and that's a much more expensive product. Other things you could consider, there's not a whole lot of modern solutions. I think there's a TT Artisans one, and you know, a lot of people do look for the old Leica viewfinders or, you know, other brands for those things. Especially for a casual user, I think going that route is kind of problematic because you run into things like haze, fungus, misalignment, dust, scratches, all sorts of things that, you know, if you're just doing it casually, you don't really want to think about that. You don't want to go on eBay and buy it and not know if that's going to be compromised in some way. Having the Smallrig as an option, I think there's a good reason to have this. I do like this. But at the end of the day, this Smallrig 28mm optical viewfinder, it's not about specs. It's really about, it helps me feel some kind of joy, have some enjoyment, some fun when I'm shooting. It's kind of like unplugged feeling where the camera is like an extension of your eye. And for me, that's worth it. Not in every situation, but you know, when I'm out having fun shooting, I do like using the Ricoh with a viewfinder. You know, sometimes it's just fun to do things for the vibes, like subscribing. If that's your vibe, why don't you subscribe? Anyway, that's it for me today. Peace out.